just please make sure just check the way your name has been spelled on the sheet, and the spelling of your organization also, because this is for the certificates that we need to achieve. Okay. So while this is being circulated, make any corrections that need to be made. Okay, should we start?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to enter into our fourth and last topic for today, identity formation online. We've already talked about that actually a good deal today. So increasingly, as I've mentioned before, what you're doing online becomes an important part of your everyday existence. This varies significantly from group to group, from country to country, but certainly for young people in the Western world that's the case, and I think increasingly in other parts of the world as well, that people are spending a lot of time online. That's an important part of their social identity. Those are communities that are important to them. And sometimes these are communities that do involve people beyond the national borders. Sometimes they don't. We have that problem that we've already talked about people tending to want to communicate with people that they already know. And so one has to seek out those opportunities for building international relations and finding people to communicate with, if that's of interest. But obviously, since we're talking about intercultural communication, that's something that's important, and I'll talk about some of the opportunities for finding those international partners and breaking out of your echo chamber and your digital box that you're in. Just might mention, and we've talked about that a little bit, who you are online can vary. You can create a new persona, and you can create a new persona for multiple services online. Some people do that, some people don't. You can create, depending on what the environment is, but if you're playing a game, for example, one of these massive multiplayer online games, you're probably going to create an avatar, which can become part of your identity as well. And how you choose that avatar can be something that you spend a lot of time thinking about, or maybe not. But that is one of the sources for, as I mentioned yesterday, that's one of the ways that my son got interested in Korean language and culture, but also has made contacts. And some of those contacts, people agree to play at a certain time so that they can chat together. And most of the time, that's an international, not always, but it's an international group. And the dynamics of language are very interesting. There you have a lot of code switching, a lot of going back and forth. And when he was talking, John McWhorter, about conventions in texting, those show up in the game world as well. They have different conventions, but they have their shortcuts as well. And so those are that's the culture of use that you have to learn as well. And you also have to learn about what there is outside the game, what all the associated websites are, and so forth. So I'm going to just, before we talk about some of the specific opportunities that I wanted to highlight, we've mentioned this before about if you're participating in an online discussion, there are language dynamics that may play a role, particularly in terms of native speakers versus non-native speakers, and acceptability and tolerance of people not using the language correctly. One of the articles for today dealt with this topic and used these terms of digital native versus a digital immigrant. So young people today, you guys, are digital natives. What does that mean, that you're a digital native? That's right. And you take advantage of all those opportunities and all those services and tools, if you want to. And most people do. Most young people do. Digital immigrants is me and Professor Malik. We did not grow up using these tools.
Oh, yeah.
And so this is something we've had to learn and adapt to. Not everybody does in the older generation. Yeah, and so, you know, there's a generation gap there in terms of wanting to use those tools and comfort in using those tools and why you would want to. My wife's mother, who is 85, just recently started using Facebook. And it's very interesting, and she now also has an email account, but this is recent. But she's slowly learning the conventions of use. This is not something, it's not intuitive necessarily. I think it is maybe, and that's one of the differences with the younger generation, the digital natives. They have an easy time learning. A lot of the skills and conventions are transferable, obviously, from one tool or service to another. But for the older generation, and for people who are new, maybe, you know, not just older people, but people who are in other countries where maybe those tools have not been generally available, might have a harder time with learning those. I see I'm out of the picture. I'm back in the picture. Okay.
I can actually, if I may add a little
Yeah.
bit to that.
Yeah.
My PhD guide and I used to have a discussion, and he is 89 years old now.
Mm.
Dr. Frank Dance, and he lives in Denver, and he would always tease me in class, and he would say, "So, Aradhna, in your and my time, this is what used to happen." Now, because in the US, people were born into the age of computers, and we started using them here quite late.
Yeah.
But I've seen a time, the transition from single-digit phone numbers to 10-digit phone numbers in my own time. I grew up in a small town in Himachal, and I remember picking up the phone and telling the phone operator
Oh,
to
yeah.
connect me to dad.
Yeah.
And I would just say, I want
Sure.
to talk to my father, and she would go on, and I mean, we didn't have to dial the number. It
Yeah.
would be a single-digit number, then we had two-digit numbers. Till that time, we had no dialing. So I would just pick
Yeah.
up and say, "Auntie, please connect me to dad," and she would go on, and how's your mother, how's your family, this, that. Okay, I'll just connect you.
Yeah.
So that is how, you know, I mean, when we talk about identity formation online, my father is 77 years old, soon to be 78, and he is very comfortable with the internet. When I went to the US, my brother was in Australia, and I was in the US, so he bought a desktop, and poor thing, he would try and figure out a time when he could talk to both of us at the same time, because we were in different parts of the world, and he was confused, thoroughly confused, but he would try and figure out, and then he learned how to use the internet, and now he keeps telling me, "Did you see this, and did you see that?" And I'm like, so
And I think it's not just generational, it's also personal. So some people just don't like typing and being online.
Yeah.
And it's there are students of mine who have a difficult time participating in discussion forums. They would much rather talk face to face. And I sometimes teach my courses in a hybrid format, and what that means is they're partially online. So we might meet once a week instead of twice a week, and then the other time we talk virtually. And some students really like that, the majority of students. But there are individuals who don't like that at all. They want the face-to-face contact, which is understandable. Yeah.
I recently taught a course on that Lawan attended, the Human Resource Management course for the certificate course in Human Resource Management through the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. Now, for the most part, it was a video course. So I was recording lectures, and then they were being transmitted at the scheduled time. So lectures were recorded much before they were put online. And there was a huge demand at the end of the course, during the course, to have some FaceTime with me. So, you know, we got so many requests. So I remember we scheduled a video conference after the course had been completed. And there were 5 or 6 colleges participated, and there was a live face-to-face discussion. They said, "We want to see who has taught us, and we'd like to talk to her."
Yeah.
And that was so nice. I was in tears by the end of that conference, because I was also getting to meet the students, even though virtually, but I could see them. They were coming. In one college, they had installed a camera, and there's a huge group of students sitting there, and then their teacher came online, and the students came one by one. They said, "Ma'am, we've been hearing you." One person even commented and said, one person said, "Ma'am, in the lecture number so and so you were coughing. I hope you're all right now." I said, "Thank you so much." I mean, I was literally in tears. I said, they wanted that connection, because if I had been teaching them in class, maybe the next time they would have come and said, "Ma'am, I hope you're okay. You can take this medicine, that medicine."
You know, that's been my experience as well when I teach online courses. If I have an initial face-to-face meeting with as many of the people who are local as possible, that's very helpful in having people get to know one another face-to-face before they start communicating online. It really is very helpful. It's not always possible. If you're teaching an online course, people may be geographically diverse, and in that case you can do a joint video conference, but it's not really the same thing as being there in the flesh. I'll give you an example of this. You know, we're talking about personal choice in terms of electronic media versus face-to-face. Last semester I had a course in which I wanted to meet with students in small groups. One meeting a week was everybody together. The other meeting I wanted to have small groups of 3 or 4 students together to meet with me, you know, for more intimate conversations, and it's a different dynamic, obviously. And so I gave the students a choice. I had these time options. The choice of either meeting in person in my office or meeting online with Skype. And out of the 6 groups for that particular class, it was a fairly small class, 20 students, only one group formed online. Only 3 or 4 students preferred online. And I think that's by and large my experience. Students will take online courses because it's convenient, but they don't really like that format. They don't really like that. They prefer face-to-face classes. It's very convenient to take online classes because you can do the work at any time. So if you're working full-time, it's no problem. You do the work in the evening or on the weekends. And the other experience that I've had is that in theory, the same content is covered in an online course and a face-to-face course. But my experience is that the learning experience is not always the same, and that the face-to-face variety usually wins out. I teach most of my courses now in this hybrid format, which I like, with meeting partly face-to-face and partly online. And to me, that's a very good format for teaching these days, because there's so much you can do online. There's so many advantages to working online, including peer-to-peer learning that we mentioned before. But there's also that face-to-face experience that's important as well. So having a mixed, I think, is really optimal.
And
Yeah.
that's precisely why you are here.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've called you all the way to India
Yeah.
in peak summer, and you come here, and the only reason is that we want FaceTime with you.
Yeah. It's wonderful. It's wonderful for me. Okay, I'm going to talk just briefly about opportunities for connecting with people online. And this is something in language learning that has become quite popular, to find a class in another country, in that country where your students are studying that language, to do a classroom exchange. And you can do that, obviously, these days in multiple ways. It used to be that those were all done through email. That's how it kind of started out. And then other options started appearing. And originally, when the internet started becoming popular in the 1990s and the early 21st century, it used to be that teleconferencing, video conferencing, was very difficult to do. There were some programs early on, the end of the 1990s, where you could do that somewhat. It was very jerky and very bad. Now, you can do multi-person video conferencing on Skype. I think recently they've upped that up to 15 people you can have in a group online. It becomes a little bit problematic when you have so many people. But for Skype, for example, and for other similar programs for the Google Hangouts, which is does the same thing, and also you can do with multiple people. It's very clever how that works, because you see small, typically very small video images of each of the participants, and then when one person is speaking, that person's image then it becomes larger, and so it tends to work fairly well, but it assumes that you have a good internet connection, and that's one of the things we were talking about before. That's one of the technical requirements for doing video teleconferencing. But one of the things that we're doing a lot at my university currently is what's called Tandem Learning. And this has become quite popular for in language classes. I think not just in the United States. This actually started in Europe, this Tandem Learning. The idea is you match up partners. You have somebody in the United States who's a native speaker of English who's learning German, and you find a German who's learning English, and you match them together. And then online, and this could be in written form, but increasingly it's through video, you do half of the time together in one language and half of the time in the other language. So you're speaking your own language for part of the time, and then you're practicing your second language the other part of the time. And so both parties partner from it. That works fairly well, because otherwise, if you're using the native speakers as resources, is that fair to them? And are they going to agree to that? So here, if you can make those arrangements, and there are services and websites that help you find such partners. And one is called tandemlearning.org, and it's the original kind of network for that, and it's based in the Netherlands. And it works quite well. And it's something that you can do on a class basis, on an individual basis. So if you're learning a language outside of institutional setting, and I'm finding that many more students are doing that, because there's so many resources for language learning. We're going to be talking about that on Thursday. But there's so many services, and many of them are free, to help you learn a new language, that you don't have to take a class. You don't have to take a formal class anymore. Depends individually how comfortable you are with that. But there are those opportunities. But so you can take advantage, if you're learning independently, you can take advantage of that opportunity to learn from native speakers. I mean, that's really important in learning a language, is having an opportunity to actually use it, and not just studying the grammar and learning vocabulary. That only will take you so far. But I wanted to mention some programs particularly that offer opportunities for intercultural learning and understanding. One of those is this program, Solia, which is, okay, I'll just tell you about it. It's a program that was set up because of, I think it started basically because of intolerance in the United States towards Muslims, towards Arabs, but Muslims and Arabs, most Americans put them in the same basket. And this is a nonprofit organization. This set up this opportunity for people from Western countries and from the United States, Western Europe, Australia, to come in virtual contact with people from the Middle East. And now they've expanded it to Northern Africa, Maghreb countries in Northern Africa as well. But the idea is they form small groups, and I think it's from 10 to 12 people who participate from a variety of cultures. They mix the nationalities. So you have some Westerners and some Middle Easterners. And they have cohorts. So you sign up for your cohort number 42. And then you stay with that group for a certain length of time. And I think you can sign up for a group that lasts a month or 2 months or a semester. In some cases, these programs are integrated into credit courses at universities. It might be part of a course on intercultural communication that you participate in that. But the idea is that you hear directly from people in the Middle East if you're American. And so the way it works, it's a very nice interface, and you can, if you have a working computer, you can go to this link and take a look at what it looks like, what the interface is. And it shows, it's really nice, it shows pictures of everybody who's online in a circle. So you're all connected. It's kind of a nice symbol. And then you see the little video images of each of the person. And here it works the same way as Skype. Whoever is speaking then shows up. But the one thing that was important in setting up this program is they have mediators, because these discussions often start off with people having using categories and stereotypes, right? So particularly Americans have a lot of inaccurate misinformation about what life is like in the Middle East. They have very little knowledge of what Muslim religion is. A lot of them will think the same way as Donald Trump, that Muslims are all bad and they're out to get the West, and it's a very violent religion. The opposite is true. It's a very peaceful religion. So it starts off with people having stereotypes and expressing those, but there's a mediator. And if you go online, there's a video. I won't play it out of the interest of time today, but it's very interesting because they actually have recorded the exchanges, and sometimes they get a little heated, but the people learn, and it's proven to be very successful. And there are other programs like that, and this is an opportunity to bring people together who normally would never come together. And it's really interesting for me to watch the video, because you can tell that the Americans who are participating are just average Americans. They're not very sophisticated. Not very knowledgeable at all about the Middle East. And here's an opportunity for them to actually engage with real people from the Middle East. They would never travel there, but being online, you have that opportunity. And there are other programs like that as well. I wanted to point to an opportunity to do similar things through Facebook. And this is a TED video that I won't play for you either, but you can watch it later. Israel and Iran, a love story. That seems like a very strange title, because these are mortal enemies. This is an area of the world where war has seemed likely for a number of years. Well, this is a video made by an Israeli who is a graphic designer, and he designs online posters. It's one of the things he likes to do, and then he posts them to Facebook. And so he made a poster one day. He said he makes these posters all the time, and he posts them to Facebook, and he says, usually I got no reaction, not a lot of likes. People just say, okay, it's okay, but there's not much reaction. So he made a poster about Israelis loving Iran and wanting to be friends with Iran. And it was a very nicely designed poster. And he said he posted it on Facebook, and then he went to bed, and he didn't expect anything to come of it. The next day, there were all kinds of likes, and he got all kinds of email messages, and people were resending that poster to their other friends on Facebook, and it went from that one circle. And that's the way Facebook works, and so people will be friends with other friends, and it can spread virally, and became very well known. And what started to happen, it started a movement in both countries, and people were creating their own posters and putting them on Facebook, advocating peace between the two countries and saying the people can get along. What's wrong with our governments that they can't get along? And it started this movement that really was quite amazing. The video is really very good, and he presents it in a wonderful way. And talking about he started this because of his children, and he really didn't want war, which seemed, this was a few years ago, seemed imminent between the two countries. And it really shows you the power of the internet. This didn't change the governments, but maybe it changed the minds of some of the people, and that's a powerful thing that can happen. And that's another example of across cultures, obviously, we're talking about. One of the other topics I just wanted to touch on briefly, and this is something that's now being studied by researchers because it's a very interesting and compelling topic. How are immigrant communities using social media? And kind of related to that, how are minority groups using social media in both perpetuating their own cultural identities in countries where they're not the mainstream culture, but also in adapting to that culture. And there have been recently a slate of articles about this, a lot of interest. And what's interesting is the results so far are mixed. On the one hand, some of these articles have shown in studies that how immigrants mostly use social media is among themselves and for solidarity and for exchanging information, practical information. For the recent flood of immigrants, for example, from Syria, Afghanistan, Northern Africa to Western Europe, social media was really important. If you saw pictures on the TV, everybody had their phones. Yeah. Afghanistan as well. Yeah. A lot of them are coming from Afghanistan. There's a lot of problems. What's that?
That's not been in news.
No. One of the issues with the immigrants now in Western Europe is there's a new agreement with Turkey and they're being sent back. But what Western Europe is accepting are not what are called economic migrants who are not fleeing dangerous situations. What they want are actual refugees, war refugees. And so, for example, Afghanistan, a lot of those were sent back from Germany because Afghanistan is considered a safe country. Whether it's safe or not, I don't know. I don't think all Afghans would agree with that. But Syria is considered not a safe country for understandable reasons. But so these people coming to Western Europe all had their cell phones and were using that to exchange information, very practical information. But these studies also dealt with to what extent were these immigrant communities using social media and the internet in general to learn about the host culture, which is important as well. So if they're going there for a few weeks, a few months, maybe a year, maybe it's that knowledge about that host culture is not so important. But if they're thinking that they're not going back, and of course nobody knows if you're fleeing Syria, you don't know how long the current conditions are going to last and how long it will be till or if the country becomes safe again. But then there were studies that have shown, well, this was actually very helpful in learning about the host culture as well. But I think this is something that it shows the pros and cons of social media, because in one sense, what some of the studies seem to be showing is that it can isolate the groups because they're staying, it's that echo chamber that we were talking about, they're staying within their immigrant communities and they're not using the web or the internet, social media in order to break out of that and learn about the host culture. Of course, there are impediments for that. Where do they go? How do they know how to get information about Germany if that's where they are? How do they make contact with Germans? And I think that one of the things that's likely to happen is that there will be programs set up similar to the one I was just talking about, Solia, with this effort to create understanding and empathy between different nationalities. I would suspect that that's going to happen in Western Europe as well, that people are going to create apps or services that will help those immigrants to use social media in order to learn about the host culture, to be able to learn enough of the language. That can be done online too, in order to function in whatever country they're in. It's important if they want to be able to work there eventually, that they learn the language. If they want to function in any way in this society, it's important that they learn the language. So I think this is something that will be interesting to see, in fact, how that emerges. And one of the things that is of interest to me personally is to see how that works in Germany. All those Syrians that are there now, what are they going to become assimilated? Are they going to stay as separate communities? The Turks, by and large, in Germany have stayed separate. The Italians who came there, by and large, have been integrated into German society. So we'll see what happens with the Syrians. But I think in one of the things that shows is how important now the social media has become for people in all kinds of conditions. It's not people just in settled society and their everyday lives, wherever they may be. But I think it's especially important in situations like this, where you need those resources, and it may be dramatically because our people are in dramatic situations. Any comments or observations, questions along those lines? Any experiences that you've had with programs that connect you, that formal programs or services that connect you with people abroad? Have you had any experiences with that? Is that something that Indian institutions do, are looking to do, or for that matter, secondary schools? It's something that's fairly common now in the United States. If you're taking a language, that your language teacher is probably going to try to do a class exchange with a class in France or Germany or Mexico, wherever. Is that something that's being done in India? Not yet. And it may because of technical issues, may because of lack of interest. It's interesting because I teach German. I've always been interested in making contact with German universities. I have research colleagues that I have contact with. It's been difficult for me to have that kind of exchange with classes at German universities for an interesting reason. And this is still the case, but I think it's changing. German universities are very rigid in their disciplines. And they say if you're using computers, that's computer science. That's not language learning. And so there hasn't been widespread use of computers in language learning or the humanities. Humanities, that's not computer science. So why would you use science? So my colleagues at German universities have very little interest in doing that. They're not really interested in online communities. I think that's coming, but at this point, and I think Germany is probably not atypical. I think that's been my experience in China as well, and with Chinese universities. We have relationships, my university, with 2 Chinese universities, and it's been kind of difficult for our Chinese language instructors to make those connections as well, I think for similar reasons. Any other comments, experiences?
During 2009, there was some student exchange program under Erasmus Mundus program.
Oh, right. Right.
It happened in my university also when I was in MBA.
Yeah.
There was in Malik University at Patna.
Okay. It's wonderful for European students now. The Erasmus program allows them very easily to study a semester or a year at another EU university in another country. It's a wonderful program. Unfortunately, it's restricted.
Three students from Europe, that is maybe from Germany. They came to our university, and 3 students from our university went to their first studies.
Okay. Yeah, it's wonderful to have. I mean, if you can go in person, that's even better than virtually. That's optimally what you want. But one of the things that can happen is virtual relationships can become real relationships, and so that's one of the things. So I'll move on here and just briefly talk about this very interesting topic of food and cultural identity. And I won't play your video. We're going to try to finish up here in a few minutes. But there are a couple of things that I think very interesting. This TED Talk by Jennifer Lee, The Hunt for General Tso, one of the most popular chicken dishes in the United States is General Tso's chicken. Well, General Tso's chicken is unknown in China. And one of the things that she points out in this TED video, she starts out by saying, by the way, that if you count up the number of Chinese restaurants in the United States, it's larger than all the major fast food chains, McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, all those combined. Chinese food is very popular in the United States. I think it's popular in India as well. But it's the American version of Chinese food, just like it is here, the Indian version of Chinese food. But it's really interesting because what she did and what she shows here is she goes to China. She's Taiwanese, of Taiwanese background, so she speaks Chinese. She goes to China and she shows them examples of Chinese food as presented in Chinese restaurants in the United States, and the reactions are wonderful. One of the traditions in Chinese food in the United States is you end the meal with what's called a fortune cookie. I don't know if that's the case in India, where you have a little cookie with a message inside. And she took those fortune cookies to China and was giving them to people, and they said, "What's this?" You know, most Americans will assume, "Oh yeah, in China, I'm sure they end all their meals at Chinese restaurants with fortune cookies." Well, no, that's not. Nobody in China knows about fortune cookies unless they've been to an American Chinese restaurant. But she also goes to the General Tso's hometown and looks for this dish, General Tso's chicken. And she talks about other American dishes. And all the most popular American Chinese dishes are unknown in China. And it's really interesting, this hybridization of cultures that is represented by food is really an interesting topic. I was talking before, yesterday, safe topics to talk about with people from different cultures. You don't want to talk about politics, you don't want to talk about religion. But food is a wonderful thing. Everybody eats, right? And everybody has opinions about what's good and what's not good. And you can argue about it, but you won't become hostile like you will in politics, possibly, or religion. You'll disagree, that's okay. That's good. And you have something to talk about. So it's a wonderful thing. There's this really, I won't play this video either. What's that? Yeah, we have time? I think it's like 6 minutes or so. But the internet is not working very well on this computer for some reason. So we'll try, but if we can't play it, that's okay. I can tell you about it.
Maybe tomorrow onwards we can just download the clip.
Yeah, it looks like it might play. Yeah. Maybe not. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe I'll start downloading the videos illegally from YouTube, and so that I actually have them available. The user agreement says you're not allowed to download YouTube videos.
So there are softwares like
But there are software that allows you. Technically, you can. Legally, you can't. I might report you, Professor Malik, if you're doing this.
Oh my God. And this is being transmitted live, so people are actually watching this.
Everybody does it. Everybody.
YouTube downloader.
you can download it.
Yeah. There are programs. There are programs to allow you to download.
Copy the link and download it through it.
Is that illegal if you do that?
I don't know about that.
There's a loophole. There's a loophole
This is a loophole.
in copyright law, at least in the United States. I don't know what the situation in India. You can use limited amounts of copyrighted material for educational purposes.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
20% of a book.
Yeah, that's right. And the same is true of video that you can use. And I use short video clips. I'm comfortable with that.
Yes.
And I think most people in the United States are comfortable.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would assume, because I've tried downloading some videos that are available on YouTube and only for educational purposes. Since this is being transmitted online, I'm not selling anything. I'm just using it for my own education and only to teach in class. But the thing I realized is that there are some videos that cannot be downloaded. So the technology must be simple enough for people to use when they put up certain videos. I've contacted people requesting them for their videos, and they say this is not for public use. The downloadable videos use a different format. So one would be surprised, if it's illegal, then why is it even technologically possible?
Yeah.
That is really surprising.
Well, at any rate, this video is about Anglo-Indian food. And, You know, everybody knows in the United States, if you're going to England, the one thing you don't want to eat is English food. At least that's the reputation in the United States. I don't know if that's the case in India. But I think, you know, if you think about European food, the French have a very good reputation for food, the English very poor. And so every American who's, this is kind of, I think, the general view. If you're going to England, you want ethnic restaurants, and the number one is Indian food, because we know that Indian food is widely available in the UK. But what this video is chicken tikka masala, which is seen as a hybrid, because it's not exactly what is served in India. It's an add-on to Indian dish. But why this is interesting is this speech by Robin Cook. Now, Robin Cook is the former foreign secretary of the UK, and he gave a speech a few years ago dealing with integration of minority cultures in England, which has been an issue in England. There's a political party now who's very anti-immigrant, and there've been issues with violence against immigrants over the past few years. But at any rate, what he says in this speech is that we have to be accepting of immigrants because they enrich our culture. And here's an example. He says, what's the national dish of the UK today? And he says it's chicken tikka masala. He said, that's the most popular dish. It's more popular than fish and chips, which is what you associate with English food. And he uses that as a symbol, as an example of how other cultures can enrich your own culture. And it's a wonderful speech. It's something I was talking before, yesterday in fact, about having leaders, politicians, in tune with intercultural understanding. And here's somebody who fit the bill as opposed to many politicians in a lot of parts of the world. Here's something else that when you're online you can go to. There's a website that has become very popular. Somebody started how you can tell if you're American. And these are kind of stereotypes of American. But also, what's the cultural knowledge that you have? How would you find out, and this was kind of interesting in the Cold War era, how would you find out if a Soviet spy is really Russian or is actually pretending to be American? What questions would you ask? What would a foreigner what kind of cultural information would a foreigner not know? One of those would be American-only sports, baseball. You mentioned famous people in baseball. So what this site does, it points out what's the expected cultural knowledge that you have if you grew up in the United States. And people have added on to that for their own cultures. And so there's that information for Japan, for France, and there's one for India. So it'd be interesting for me if you go there. Do you agree with what's presented there as what's a typical what's the cultural information that your typical Indian you could assume your typical Indian would know about? And for the American culture, it included not only sports but foods. It included television shows that were popular and so forth. That kind of information. But let me ask you this. This is what I'll end with today. What's the image of U.S. food culture that you have in India that one has in the rest of the world? What's your sense of what American food culture is like? What Americans tend to eat, want to eat, and eat in general every day? What's the image? What's the stereotype of America? Burgers, right? Junk food, hamburgers. And how do they consume that junk food? Where do they eat their food? At McDonald's, KFC. Do they eat it in those restaurants? It's takeaway. But they don't eat it at home. They eat it in their cars. This is a very this is part of U.S. culture. you see this really strange phenomenon of people going to McDonald's, and they go through the drive-through, and they get their food, and they go park, and they're eating their car. Most Americans don't do that. They eat while they're driving. It's a very bad thing to do. Americans drive while they're doing all kinds of things, texting and eating at the same time, potentially. But I think, you know, that is true, that goes on, and it's widespread in the United States, and it tells you something about U.S. culture. How food is consumed, I think, is really interesting. When I go to China, I'm always amazed by how many restaurants there are there. I did a Google search before I went to Beijing last year of the neighborhood where I was going to be. I did a Google search on restaurants. There were thousands of red dots indicating restaurants all around where I was going. This is part of Chinese culture. They don't take takeout in the United States. When you go to a Chinese restaurant, rarely do you eat there. You take it out. With Chinese food, you don't usually eat it in your car because it's a little messy. Hamburgers is fine, but Chinese food doesn't work that well in a car. But the Chinese restaurants, the culture there is completely different. You sit for a long time. You drink beer usually, and you socialize. And it's something that lasts a long time. Americans are in a hurry. This has to do with the time orientation that we were talking about, right? Time is money. That's important in the United States. Chinese is very relaxed. Now contrast that with Russia. I was mentioning Professor Malik, I'm going to Russia next month. Nobody eats out in Russia. There are very few restaurants. I'm going to this fairly a pretty large city in the south of Russia, and I've been there before. There are maybe 3 or 4 restaurants, and they're very expensive, and Russians rarely go there. It's the mirror image of China, and I don't know exactly what that says about Chinese Russian culture, but people tend to stay in their families more, and they tend to not socialize as much outside of their family units and more with their work colleagues. One of the other things about Chinese food culture is how important going out together with restaurants are in work environments. And this is true in Japan as well. A lot of the business that's done is done over food with a lot of drinking. In China in particular, they like what's called white lightning, which is a very strong liquor. And one of the reasons they do that, and particularly I think this is true in Japan, is it overcomes the kind of natural shyness that people have, and also creates that level playing field we were talking about, you know, where you show respect to your upper, the bosses and the people higher up in the hierarchy. That if you drink together, you kind of create a comradeship that allows a little freer discussion, and maybe, you know, the subordinates would be more likely to offer suggestions than they would in a formal office environment where there's a formal hierarchy. So, you know, that's one of the things I think is, you know, if you talk about intercultural communication, food culture is something that's really interesting to study. I think at that point it would be good to end up. Any comments, questions, experiences to share? No? We can do that informally. Okay, thank you very much.